I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today on a topic that's actually quite close to my heart. I'm very close to my parents who are aging. So my dad just turned 80 in April of this year, and my mom will be turning 78 in November of this year. My mom comes from a family of 6. She's the 3rd oldest, and her oldest brother actually currently is in advanced Alzheimer's disease. So certainly as a daughter and as a researcher and as a physical therapist, I really have a strong interest in dementia prevention, in particular how physical activity plays a role in that. And a more sort of higher level or global scale, how physical activity would promote brain health in older adults. So what I'd like to do in the next 60 minutes or so is to really share with all of you the latest and I think really exciting research that really supports the notion that physical activity has a significant role in promoting brain health in later years. And just to provide some context to my talk today, I'll just briefly provide some background information. So we know with aging there is a general decline in cognition. So on average, if you observe an individual as they age, they do experience, again, on average, some decline in their cognitive performance, whether it's memory, reasoning, even arithmetic ability, or spatial orientation, meaning finding where they are in a new place. Sorry. Okay. And these cognitive changes actually concur with significant changes in both brain structure and brain function. So for example, here in this figure, what I'm trying to illustrate is that with advanced age, so age is on the horizontal axis, and this is volume or the amount of brain matter in a specific region, we observe that generally with age, there is a reduction in amount of brain matter in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a brain structure that is primarily responsible for memory. So we do know that when you have reduced hippocampus volume, you also typically have reduced memory capacity or abilities. And significant shrinkage in the hippocampus is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So with these observations in mind, it does beg the question, is cognitive decline inevitable with aging? And surprisingly, there's also a rich body of literature to suggest that there's actually a lot of variability in which individuals decline with age. So for example, here, this was a paper published in 2002, and again, just to orient everyone to the graph here, on the bottom axis we have age, on the vertical axis we basically have cognitive performance, specifically speed or processing speed. And each line here actually represents an individual, meaning we observe them when they initially, let's say for this individual was 75, we repeatedly measure them until they were just over 80 years old. So each line represents how an individual has changed over time or with age. So again, if you just look at the overall cloudy sort of cloud that's created by these individual lines, we do see a general trajectory for reduced cognitive ability with age. However, if you look also at the red lines that I specifically highlighted, you also do observe a lot of individuals who actually improve with age or maintain with age. And if you look at this graph quite carefully, there's actually a lot of individuals who tend to maintain their cognitive abilities with age. So the current thought is that while decline is common with aging, significant decline is not an absolute consequence of aging. And there's a lot of interest currently to figure out what factors are driving these individual variabilities, such as what is promoting an individual to at least maintain their cognitive abilities as they age. And certainly from both animal studies and human studies that use advanced neuroimaging, we do now recognize that the brain is actually plastic throughout the lifespan, meaning it can change even in later years. Specifically, we do know that both the brain structure and function can adapt both positively and negatively to experience. And this capacity is termed neuroplasticity. And this ability of the brain is akin to your muscles if, let's say, today you decide to take on strength training. You would expect your muscles to get stronger and more toned if you comply with the training protocol. And so in a similar way, your brain is able to adapt quite positively if you provide the appropriate stimulus. And again, the most sort of promising evidence is that this, again, capacity is retained in age. with age. So given that the aging population, or the population is aging, and that individuals are also living longer, there is a lot of interest currently as to how to promote brain health in later years. And there's many lifestyle factors that are sort of coming to the forefront in terms of research interests, including nutrition. So candidates include omega-3s and potentially, other types of vitamins and minerals that, are you getting enough to promote your brain health? Sleep, both quantity and quality. We do know that as individuals age, sleep is disrupted, and that seemed to associate with cognitive decline as well. And another factor that people are quite interested in is how are you stimulating your brain cognitively? So are you always trying to learn a new skill, such as, are you trying to learn a new game, picking up a new hobby? Are you playing poker? Are you stimulating yourself cognitively? And certainly on the sort of a commercial level, there is a lot of computer games that say that it can train your brain to be smarter and faster, but the evidence is still, I would say, kind of equivocal. Also, how do you manage your stress? We do know that chronic stress is definitely detrimental to your brain. Cortisol that is released during stressful events is definitely toxic to the brain. So there's, again, a lot of interest as to how you can manage your stress so that you can, again, protect your brain. And then socialization. Within the literature of healthy aging, socialization has been highlighted as a key factor to healthy aging. And we also do now recognize that socialization, the maintenance of social connections as you age, is potentially important for maintaining both cognitive function and also brain function. And the last factor is obviously physical activity, and that's what I'm here today to share with all of you, is the evidence on the role of physical activity. But I do want to take a second and highlight that in terms of physical activity, I do believe it actually crosses into the other domains that I also have already highlighted. We do know that if you are physically active, your quality of sleep can improve. As well, when you are physically active, you tend to associate with better stress management. And many of us probably do partake in physical activity to manage our stress, right? Whether it's going out for a run after a really stressful day, or doing yoga to help yourself relax and to sort of regroup your thoughts. Physical activity is also highly associated with socialization. If you join a community center exercise program, you tend to meet new people, make new connections. And as well, with every sort of adoption of a positive behavior, we tend to see positive adoption in other domains such as nutrition. So again, we do know that if you adopt to be more physically active, you tend to be more aware of your nutrition as well. And lastly, I would argue when you are physically active, you are also challenging yourself cognitively, whether it is about monitoring your physical activity level, learning a new exercise or activity. So let's say you take up squash today, and if you've never been a squash player before, there's a lot of learning involved, whether it's motor learning, strategic planning, or just sort of engaging in the activity that is quite new to you. So again, physical activity, I do encourage all of us to think about being more, sort of the benefit on brain health being much broader than the physical benefits. Now, in terms of the roadmap of the talk from here on, what I'd like to do today is, in terms of looking at the role of physical activity, first what I'll do is really highlight key studies that have described the relationship between physical activity and brain health, and include some of the underlying mechanisms that has been observed or potentially put forth as candidate pathways as to how physical activity does promote brain health. And then the last bit, what I want to do is really highlight some of the most recent papers that really provide some interesting information that is highly relevant to how we would apply physical activity in the context of promoting cognitive and brain health, such as how much physical activity is required. Now, before I sort of dive into the studies, I just want to highlight different study designs, and I think it's important because it really allows us to evaluate the level of evidence in describing the relationship between, again, physical activity and brain health. So today what I'll largely be talking about is two types of studies. A cohort study, which is typically a population study whereby you recruit a large number of people and you follow them over time. We do not prescribe any intervention or specific treatments, we simply observe. And what typically these studies do is describe relationships. So for example, we will measure people's physical activity at baseline, then follow them through time, and look at, how is the relationship of the baseline physical activity relate to the risk of developing dementia in later years. The other study design that I'll be speaking on is randomized controlled trials, which again also does track people over time. However, it does include a specific intervention or treatment. So when people participate in such studies, they are randomly or by chance allocated to a specific intervention such as aerobic training, resistance training, or nutrition. And then within these studies, what we do is we observe how these individuals change in response to these individual interventions. Again, it does describe relationships, but it potentially provides more evidence for a cause and effect, okay, because you're deliberately intervening with a specific course of action. So the first study I want to highlight today is a cohort study that was actually published back in 2004. This study included approximately 1,900 women in the United States and followed them through, on average, 8 to 15 years. And overall, what they found was that, again, higher levels of long-term regular physical activity were strongly associated with higher levels of cognitive function and less cognitive decline. So this is probably a result that you're expecting to hear, but just to quantify it much more so, that actually equates to those individuals at higher levels of regular physical activity being 3 years younger in age, okay? Which is quite significant, and as well a 20% lower risk of cognitive impairment, again, over the observation period of 8 to 15 years of follow-up. Now, often the question that is asked of me is, well, is it always just about the really high level of physical activity? What about more moderate levels of physical activity? Well, what they also did find was that the benefit of physical activity was not restricted to those at the highest level of physical activity. What they did observe is that those who walked equals to or greater than 1.5 hours per week at a pace of 21 to 30 minutes per mile show significantly less cognitive decline than those who walk for less than 38 minutes per week. Now, for those who have taken lessons, extensive lessons in PowerPoint, I know there's a really wordy slide, so I'm going to break it down. So what does this mean really? It's a lot of numbers, but let's break it down. So 21 to 30 minutes per mile, which is sort of the rate of walking, actually equates to walking 4 times around a standard track in 30 minutes. So how many of you think that's a pretty fast pace? Does that seem like a fast pace to all of you? No, a pretty moderate pace would be my opinion. And so we're really not talking about a speed walk, but rather just like a pace that you would walk, let's say, with your dog, okay, or a middle-aged dog. I love dogs, by the way. So I equate everything to what it feels like being a dog. And when we break down the time frame, 1.5 hours per week, let's assume, that actually breaks down to approximately only 13 minutes per day. Versus, again, the sedentary group is approximately 5 minutes per day. So we're talking about you'll have some neuroprotection if you walk approximately 13 minutes per day, which again, I'm not familiar with the city of Edmonton, but certainly on the UBC campus, it takes me longer than that to get to the closest Tim Horton from my office and back. So, coffee is good for you in that sense. And then when we look at both the time frame and the rate, this really breaks down to walking 2 times around a standard track and 15 minutes per day is neuroprotective. So again, pretty manageable for most individuals, including older adults. Now, in terms of randomized controlled trials, I want to sort of take a second and to talk about types of exercise training. So when we talk about exercise training or types of physical activity, we can broadly define them as aerobic training, such as running, walking, swimming, activities in which you're trying to increase your heart rate. The second type, or most common type, is resistance training, which is strength training or lifting weights. So you're trying to increase your muscle strength or muscle power by increasing loading to your limbs. For older adults, and certainly for athletes as well, balance and agility training is also a primary type of training, but I have to admit, not as widely studied within the context of how it may promote brain health. And others that are emerging within the context of brain health and physical activity is yoga, tai chi, and dance. But again, the evidence is just emerging, but certainly there is a lot of interest in these modes of physical activity as well. So for today, what I'll really be focusing on is two types of training within randomized controlled trials: aerobic training and resistance training. So in terms of aerobic training, certainly in the area or in the research forum of how physical activity may promote brain health, aerobic training is the most studied type of training. Okay, even back in the 1970s, there's a paper published looking at how aerobic fitness is related to cognitive performance. And in 2002, Art Kramer, who truly is a leader in this area of research, published a meta-analysis or a summative study looking at the overall effect of aerobic training on cognitive function in older adults. And what he concluded was that exercise training is beneficial for different cognitive abilities. So when we think about cognitive abilities, most of us think about memory, because again, when we think about dementia, we think about memory loss. But really, cognition is much broader than that. It includes cognitive abilities such as planning, decision-making, multitasking, mental math, spatial orientation. Again, being able to find yourself within a new space is also a cognitive ability. And what he found is that exercise is actually beneficial across multiple domains of cognition, but was the most beneficial for executive functions. And executive functions are cognitive processes that really are those that you need to maintain independence within society, because it includes cognitive abilities such as planning, decision-making, and multitasking. And these cognitive processes actually are most sensitive to aging effects. So it is quite nice that aerobic training is also the most beneficial for executive functions. On a very interesting note, and there's still a lot more research that needs to be done within this context, is that he also found that studies with more women showed larger effects or larger benefits of training. So currently there tends to be an observation that when it comes to the cognitive benefits of exercise, women or older women seem to benefit more so than men. As to the underlying mechanisms, we're still not quite sure, but certainly it is a strong area of research. And the last point, which I find is very promising, is that he found that the benefit of training is similar for both normal and cognitively impaired older adults. So when we talk about the role of physical activity in promoting brain health, it's not just for those who are cognitively healthy, but is potentially beneficial for those who already have some cognitive decline or early dementia issues. Then moving forward, Art Kramer's group really advanced this area of how aerobic training may be beneficial for brain health by then looking at what are the effects of this type of exercise, not only on cognitive function, but also on brain function and brain structure using advanced neuroimaging. So they conducted a series of studies, all randomized controlled trials, whereby, again, they recruit a number of individuals. They randomize individuals either to a walking program or an aerobic-based training program, a control group that includes stretch and relaxation, and they follow them for approximately 6 or 12 months, depending on the study, to observe how aerobic training may benefit cognitive performance and brain function. So the first study they published in 2004 demonstrated that after 6 months of 3 times a week walking, that there is significant benefit for executive function. So people were able to perform better on tests of executive function. And as well, this concurred with changes in brain function, meaning that areas of the brain that we do know support executive functions were actually more efficient during the task performance. So individuals went into an MRI or magnetic resonance imaging. They actually then performed the same task that they performed in the lab, and they took images of the brain, and they were able to show that for those individuals who were in the walking program, the brain was much more efficient at completing the task as compared to those individuals who were randomized to the stretch and relaxation group. In addition, they also demonstrated that a 6-month, 3 times a week walking program increased brain volume after 6 months. So shrinkage of the brain is a hallmark of aging, regardless of whether you have dementia or not. There is some degree of brain shrinkage that occurs with aging, again, on average. And here, what Stanley Colicoum and Art Kramer showed is that after 6 months of training, there were significant increases in brain volume, again, in areas that typically, again, are very sensitive to aging effects. So this is quite positive, and again, hasn't been demonstrated prior to their publications. And then Kirk Erickson, who also is with Art Kramer, he published a paper in 2011, which really I thought showed quite beautiful results on the benefits of aerobic training. Here, this training study was for 12 months, again, 3 times a week of walking program. And again, I want to emphasize for this walking program, it was, again, moderate intensity. The class duration itself was 50 minutes, but only 40 minutes was dedicated to training. So the other 10 minutes was allocated to warm up or cool down, and cool down, not or. And after 12 months of training, Kirk showed that that individuals who were in the walking program significantly improved their memory ability, which again, we commonly associate with dementia or with aging. And as well, he showed that the hippocampus, which I previously had already highlighted, is primarily responsible for memory, increased by 2%. Okay. Now, 2% may not sound like a heck of a lot, right? Especially if you're talking about interest rates, not a lot at all. Actually, although right now I think we're lucky if we get 2%. But again, that actually equates to reversing your age, at least brain age, by up to 2 years. So think about it. That's really, really good investment, right? You put in 1 year of your time, you actually get double the return in your sort of brain age. So again, very, very promising results. And that finding really concurs with Kirk's previous work, where he showed a nice linear relationship between cardiovascular fitness, so how fit are you, as compared with hippocampus volume. So for those individuals who have a higher fitness, they tend to have a higher hippocampus volume, even after adjusting for age. Now, what about individuals with some degree of cognitive decline? So again, that is a common question I'm asked. So is that, if exercise is beneficial for those who are already otherwise healthy but potentially sedentary, could those benefit transfer to individuals who already have changes in their cognitive function? And the answer is yes. So in 2010, Baker et al. Conducted a 6-month randomized control trial looking at aerobic training. This time the frequency was 4 times a week. They included older women with mild cognitive impairment. So just to describe mild cognitive impairment, this is a condition by which these individuals do not have dementia, but if we observe them and also assess them, we can objectively measure that they are showing some decline in different cognitive domains. And if you ask, or if you interview the individual will typically say, yes, I've noticed changes in sort of how I remember or how I make decisions. I can't seem to be able to make decisions as well as I used to, etc. But otherwise, they're still quite independent. They're still living typically on their own, still managing their own finances, but probably more challenged and requiring some support through family members or a close friend. But we also do know that for individuals with MCI or mild cognitive impairment, they are at greater risk for developing dementia. So over a 5-year window, those individuals with mild cognitive impairment, half will convert to dementia. So in terms of populations to be studied, this particular population is receiving a lot of interest, because if we're talking about intervening at an opportunistic time, this particular group of individuals may, again, they're at greater risk for developing dementia, but they're still quite functional in which that they can still receive instructions and potentially comply with prescription. So What Baker found after 6 months, again, concurring with the previous findings of Art Kramer, is that they found significant improvement in executive functions. And in terms of mechanisms, they found that those individuals in the aerobic training group also demonstrated reduced fasting plasma levels of insulin and cortisol. So I'm not sure if many of you do recognize this, but risk factors for dementia includes diabetes, okay? And as well as chronic stress. So that's where cortisol comes into play. So it's quite interesting that they show that this, for the aerobic training group, there was a significant reduction in the levels of both insulin and cortisol, and that they also observed significant improvement in executive functions. And in terms of aerobic training and the benefit on brain function, so right now it's a really exciting time in exercise neuroscience, especially within the context of neuroimaging techniques, etc. So nowadays we're able to not only look at how large your brain is, so looking at brain structure and looking at the specific volumes within each area, or looking at how each area potentially activates during a cognitive task, but we can also look at how now the brain coordinates with each other. I always kind of describe it as a symphony or an orchestra, okay? So the brain is like an orchestra. You want all parts of it to sort of play in synchrony for maximum performance, okay? And so nowadays we are able to look at that synchronization across different parts of the brain and how they potentially will change with both age, with exercise, and also with neurodegeneration. And there are several networks that we're most interested in. I won't go into each system in detail, but certainly the ones that you may have heard of if you are in this area is the default mode network, the frontoexecutive, the frontoparietal network, and then also how these two networks really overlap is highlighted in sort of the light blue. The default mode network is a network that actually is active during rest, which sounds odd, but there's recognition now that even at rest, when you're not thinking about anything, your brain is active. And how that activity may change with age is actually quite indicative of your risk for Alzheimer's. So the default mode network has been widely studied within the context of Alzheimer's disease, but also in healthy aging. The frontoexecutive system is really a system that's primarily responsible for executive function, but again, not just how each region activates, but how they activate in accordance with each other. And the frontoparietal is also related to executive functions, but also related to motor control, okay? And what Michelle Foss in 2010 found was that after aerobic training, you actually also see improvements in network connectivity. So that after you actually participate in aerobic training, your brain actually synchronizes much better with each other, meaning that the orchestra has improved in its ability to play the music as it's meant to be. And that's quite a novel finding and has not been previously demonstrated. Furthermore, what she demonstrated too was that the significant change in the connectivity was related to changes in growth factors. So growth factors are proteins or steroid hormones that circulate in your body and also in your brain. And we do know that growth factors are essential for brain function and brain health. So candidate growth factors include the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, IGF-1, and VEGF, which is a growth factor responsible for vascularization of the brain. And what Michelle showed was that with this change in connectivity was that she also saw significant changes or increases in circulating growth factor after the aerobic training, which is, again, very nice association, and as well really concurs with our current understanding of how potentially this activity may promote brain health. So then with the highlight on aerobic training, I want to now really talk about what are the potential effects of resistance training on cognitive function, brain function, and also brain structure as well. And as already highlighted, in terms of within the area of exercise neuroscience, aerobic training really has been the forefront in terms of the type of physical activity that's been studied. However, I would argue that in terms of resistance training, it is a type of training that is really quite essential to healthy aging. We do know that resistance training moderates sarcopenia, or the age-related loss in muscle mass and strength. And sarcopenia, the consequence of sarcopenia includes falls and fracture risk, which we all know are significant consequences for an older adult. Resistance training also promotes bone health, sorry, which again is quite important when we're talking about older adults, and potentially more so for older women who are more prone to osteoporosis and osteopenia. But the last point is also from a very practical point of view, not everyone can participate in aerobic training. Not everyone has the mobility to participate in walking, running, and potentially even swimming. Okay, so if we really are advocating this activity as a way of promoting brain health, we really need to provide evidence about the different types of exercise that could potentially be of benefit. So in 2007, a Brazilian group led by Casellas did that exactly. They looked at what is the effect of resistance training on cognitive function. So it was a 6-month randomized control trial. There were 3 groups, two resistance training groups, but training at different levels of intensity, and a control group. And what they found is that for both groups of resistance training, there was significant improvement in both memory and executive function. I want to highlight that for this particular study, they only included men, again, because we do recognize there seems to be some differences in how the males and females respond to exercise in terms of cognitive health. And what we did in 2010 and 2011 is to look at a similar question, but in older women. So here, the Brain Power Study, which is a study we conducted at the University of British Columbia, we recruited individuals between the ages 65 to 75 and randomized them to either once-a-week resistance training, twice-a-week resistance training, or a control group, and then followed them to observe how they may change both cognitively and also in terms of brain function and structure. So we included 155 women in this particular study. Generally, they were healthy, but not participating in resistance training. In terms of the resistance training protocol, it was either twice or once, depending on which group they were randomized to. There were 60-minute classes, but again, only 40 minutes was dedicated to training. We did use a progressive loading protocol, meaning that every time an individual was able to lift 2 sets of 8 repetitions with proper form, we would increase the loading so that they are, being continually challenged. And the control group was a balance and tone group that also met for twice a week, and they were also together for 60 minutes per class. And at this point, I just really want to briefly highlight our balance and tone group, believe it or not, because often I'm asked the question, well, it could be that, for both the resistance training or for aerobic training, the reason why they're improving is because they are now, having more social support, or they're socializing, or they're becoming more active just generally. And that is true. And this is why we always tend to have an active control group. And so here for this video, which I hope it works, what you'll see, and these are individuals in our balance and tone group, what you will see is that they are participating in some light physical activity.
Slowly coming up, 3 more down, 2 for you, and 2, 3, 4, and 5, slowly up, 2 more down, 2 D for 2, 3, 4, and 5, up, and last one, Y, Y for 2,
I think you should sing that song for us. You did that other day. That was fantastic.
Which one?
You know,
T
they
for 2, that
T
will
for
shut it all off.
Very good.
So my point there was to really show that in terms of the control groups that we implement in these randomized control trials really is quite a comparator to try to beat, if that makes any sense. They are doing some exercise, as you can tell, they're doing squats, some light arm exercises, and there's lots of socialization. So then at the end of our 12-month trial, what did we find? We did find, again, similar to the aerobic training trials, is that resistance training did improve executive functions, specifically attention and decision making. And we also saw nice changes within the functional MRI data, whereby, again, we saw efficiency in terms of how the brain is working while performing the same tasks. And I just want to highlight the percent change that we observed for both resistance training group was from 11 to 13%. Oh, sorry. And I also want to flag that we found the resistance training was cost effective. So we do try to do research that potentially could impact policy, and it's quite a challenge to do that. And what we've done within our trials is always to implement an economic evaluation, meaning can we, A, first show that there is a benefit, and two, is it cost-worthy to then implement such a program, such as a resistance training group within the community, after you take into account the cost for the personnel, the equipment, etc., as compared to the healthcare dollars that you could potentially save. And here we actually did find that for both resistance training group, it actually was cost-saving, meaning that it was effective. So the new treatment was more effective than standard being the control group, but also was less costly. Okay. And again, that hasn't really been shown in previous trials of exercise and cognitive function, so we were quite excited about that. Now, we did extend our research looking at how resistance training may also promote cognition in those with MCI. So for this particular trial, we included individuals with mild cognitive impairment, randomized them to twice-a-week resistance training, twice-a-week aerobic training, and twice-a-week balance and tone. And I want to highlight, this is the only study to date that really has looked at both types of exercise in one randomized controlled trial. And we included 86 women who had mild cognitive impairment, and that was defined as having objective cognitive deficits when we measured them, and also that they themselves had a subjective memory complaints. And the third criteria was that they were not diagnosed with dementia. And again, very positive findings. You must be getting sick of this in terms of the trends, but it's very positive overall. Again, after 6 months, we found that for the twice-a-week resistance training, we saw significant benefit in executive functions. And surprisingly, we actually observed an absolute change of 17%, actually to a greater magnitude of benefit as compared to what we observed for those who are otherwise healthy in the previous study called the Brain Power Study. And as well, we observed this benefit after only 6 months, while for the previous trial among otherwise healthy older adults, it took us 12 months to observe the benefit. So it's actually quite exciting, and it really does suggest that in terms of the benefit of exercise, it actually may be more potent among those with some cognitive deficits as compared to those individuals without. And then in terms of the aerobic training within the context of this particular trial, we actually did see that it was beneficial in terms of memory. So in terms of memory, what we had individuals do is try to learn 15 words, and we repeated the list of 15 words 5 times, and after each trial, they would have to try to spontaneously recall the number, as many words as they could recall. Then we would give them a list B, which had a completely different set of 15 words, and then immediately afterwards basically said, okay, how many can you recall from the first list now? It's a pretty cruel task at hand, but that's what we did. And what we found was that those individuals in the aerobic training group were able to retain more words from the first list after being distracted by the second list as compared with the control group. So in summary, moderate physical activity is beneficial for cognitive function. So I want to highlight within all the randomized controlled trials that I highlighted, the physical activity level was moderate. And then as well, the benefit does exist even among those who are at greater risk for dementia. And the second point is that, as you may recognize, all these trials included older adults, right? So 65 being the minimum age, and then as high as to 80 years old. And so really what we're also demonstrating here is that starting to exercise in late life is not futile, right? Because if we can show change only after 6 months, the benefit must still exist, and that, you know, that starting in late life is quite, is still very possible to reap benefits if you're starting later in life, even if you've been sedentary previously. And as well, across the different studies, physical activity does induce changes in both brain structure, brain function, and also through, likely through the increases of growth factor levels, glucometabolic, and stress responses. So these are some of the mechanisms that we're observing now, is that with the changes in behavior, we're seeing changes in brain function, brain structure, but also in systemic circulating growth factors and these type of responses. Other pathways that have been highlighted in research, but I haven't really talked about, is that it includes sleep, mental wellness, and self-efficacy. Okay. However, more research is needed to refine the prescription for physical activity for maximum benefit. So I would say at this point, we do know that physical activity is beneficial, but we still probably need to know more about the frequency, the intensity, the type, and the duration of physical activity to really prescribe it for maximum benefit. And as well, we do need to extend the research to include now those individuals who have dementia or potentially with different types of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease versus vascular dementia. And then the last bit I'll just finish off with is sort of the relevance to healthy aging. So within the context of physical activity and brain health, a very common question that we often ask is, what are the long-term consequences of regular physical activity? So for the previous trials I talked about, they were 6 months, 12 months in duration. We measured them immediately after the intervention, and we observed benefit. But what about what happens to them afterwards? And so a really nice study came out recently that was published by Kirk Erickson, and he's now at Pittsburgh, and he basically did a nice study using the cardiovascular health study data, and it's a cohort study of heart disease and dementia. And essentially what they did is ask individual, how many city blocks do you walk per week at baseline? So at the time of recruitment, they asked individuals this particular question. On average, how many city blocks do you walk per week? And what they found was that 9 years later, that those who walk greater distances had greater brain volume. Furthermore, that the greater brain volume was related to reduced risk of cognitive impairment. And within this same study, they asked a question, how much regular physical activity is necessary? So what they did is they divided the participants into 4 groups based on the number of blocks walked. So group 1, on average, walked 0 to 12 blocks per week. Group 2, 13 to 24. Group 3, 25 to 70 blocks. And Group 4, 72 to 300 blocks. And what they found is that those individuals who walked 72 city blocks or more per week had demonstrated the neuroprotection. So what does 72 blocks look like? I did the math. Probably not surprised. So 1 city block typically is 80 to 100 meters. So assuming 100 meters, so I'm being a little bit more on the conservative side, that's equating to 7,200 meters per week, right? Or 7.2 kilometers per week. Are we all in agreement? Just to make sure my mental math or math is correct. So 7.2 kilometers per week equals to just over 1 kilometer per day. And 1 kilometer per day equals to 2.6 laps around the standard track, which again actually concurs beautifully with the first study I talked about, right? The very first study I talked about, which is walking twice around a standard track in approximately 15 minutes was found to be neuroprotective. 2.6 laps or 10.3 city blocks per day. And if we assume an average walking speed of 1.35, and that's the average walking speed for a healthy older adult, that equates to just under a 13-minute walk per day. Or if we assume a slower walking speed, so the average walking speed of 0.65 For a more frail older adult, that translates to a 26-minute walk. And again, in my mind, a fairly feasible target to achieve. And lastly, last slide, I promise, is adopting physical activity later in life. Is it still beneficial? So I hope that I've already sort of flagged that it is beneficial, just given that for the randomized controlled trials, we demonstrated that you can actually improve cognitive function in older adults, not just maintain. I really want to highlight this. For the randomized controlled trials, we saw improvement, not just maintenance. And so this really is backed up by this study that was recently published last year, I believe, last year by Laura Middleton. And here for this particular study, just over 9,000 women were included. And they basically had individuals self-report their physical activity as a teenager at the age of 30, age of 50, and late life. And what they found was that those who were physically active at any age, although in particular as teenagers, had better cognitive performance and lower likelihood of cognitive impairment than those who were physically inactive. And I think more importantly is that those who were physically inactive as teenagers but became active in later life still had some degree of neuroprotection. So truly, it's never too late to start. So in summary, regular physical activity is sufficient for maintaining brain health. And again, we're talking about moderate levels of physical activity. It's never late to start, although potentially earlier the better. And it really is akin to the saying that a sound mind in a healthy body, so that really these two components, or these two aspects are tightly linked. And the overall conclusion is that physical activity, in my mind, is a legitimate medical therapy. It's not just an alternative or a lifestyle. I really do think we have to start viewing it as a very pragmatic approach in terms of medicine, as much as medicine is sort of respected or sort of pharmaceutical agents. I do believe it is a magic bullet, and it is a poly pill to health and overall being. And what do I mean by poly pill? Pardon? Yeah, so I mean, when we talk about older adults, they typically are on a medication to treat their hypertension, to treat their diabetes, to treat their cholesterol. Well, physical activity has shown to effectively reduce all those components, and now also a lot of strong evidence to show that it can also combat cognitive decline. So it really should, again, have the respect in terms of the traditional medicine approach of, again, it's a legitimate medical therapy, and that it really deserves the amount of attention that we pay to drug interactions, drug prescription, and drug development, in my mind. Lastly, I do also believe physical activity is a key to both the quantity and quality of life. Again, I think I've already highlighted in a previous video how by participating in physical activity, there's a lot of other side benefits. But here I just want to highlight two of our participants in one of our current trials. He actually finished his intervention period a year ago. He decided to come back and volunteer as a group leader for our walking program, and he's done this for now a year and a half now since we started the trial, and he finished his own program, and this is a current participant. And for this particular slide is a past participant we had who decided to show up in his attire for Halloween. But again, it's just things that we observe, and we do know that physical activity really has such a broad benefit that is beyond what we can typically measure within any context. Lastly, I just want to recognize all the individuals I have the pleasure working with, both my collaborators, the students and staff, and then just the funding agency. Thanks so much.
Are there any questions? Fascinating talk. Certainly, right here.
Hi, I'm a physio here at I love the program. I have two questions actually. When you were doing one of your studies, you said about balance and tone. What were you specifically using for balance and tone exercises?
Sure. So, is this on? No. Hi. Okay. So in terms of the balance exercises, we actually used a lot of Tai Chi exercises, so quite challenging. And then for the tone exercises, as you saw, squats, lunges, lunge walks. The only difference was that there's no external loading involved. So unlike the resistance training where we continually progressed and added external loading, so they're always challenged in terms of the loading, for the balance and tone, they actually, again, were exercising. They simply did not have that external loading factor involved.
And my second question is, could you please describe sarcopenia again? You were talking about falls and fractures.
Sure.
I didn't quite get that.
Sure. So sarcopenia basically is a term used to describe the age-related, the significant loss in muscle mass and strength that's commonly associated with aging. And currently, resistance training is directly combats that effect, while I would say aerobic training doesn't as much. And we know that when you have reduced muscle strength, you are at greater risk for falls. And as well, in terms of bone health, there's a very tight relationship between your skeletal system and your bone system. So just because your skeletal system really produces the forces that acts on your bone, right? So if you are not loading through your muscles, you have less mechanical stimuli to your bone as well, so you are at greater risk for developing osteoporosis or osteopenia.
Hi, I run a seniors activity center, and I just wanted to get clarification on the benefits of the balance and toning. You did quickly the chart of what effect it did after they did balance toning versus aerobic. What
Sure.
was the?
Yeah, so basically what we actually observed within our balance and tone is that they maintained.
They maintained.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then as compared to the resistance training group, they improved. And that's always, something I need to emphasize more. And certainly when we talk to neurologists and we're trying to collaborate on these research grants, they typically will be quite conservative and say, well, for the treatment group, so the resistance training group, we should only be expecting maintenance. To actually improve would be probably a little bit too much, and the reviewers won't like that. But we're actually observing that time and time again is that we actually see improvement in cognitive performance within the targeted treatment groups. And then for most of the control groups, what we're seeing is a maintenance. So I do think there's some level of benefit there, but
Okay.
within these studies, we're just always looking for the difference between the groups.
Okay, and just finally, hopefully you'll be able to access some of this online after the presentation and the particularly your studies, because I know we're trying to advocate to the government to help seniors fund physical activity programs, so that kind of research would be helpful. So
Sure.
will that be available?
Yes, it will
Okay,
be.
thank
Yep.
you.
John Spence back there.
Thank you very much. Very, very fine presentation, Dr. Liu. Here's the question I've got, because it's a bit of a paradox.
Sure.
The research is very clear, but the same brain up here is telling me I don't follow what is best for me. So I don't know in terms of, and that's honestly, I mean that in a little bit of reading I've done, not anywhere, no research kind of thing, but it really, the same brain doesn't want change. It resists. And so I wonder, because the research is so clear, but yet most of us, as majority of Canadians, are not doing it. And it's
Yes.
getting worse.
Yes.
So the question would be, in all of the work you've done so far, is there anything that we can do up here to train or tweak this thing to say, you know what's good for you, would you please do it?
Sure. I mean, for us, that's a challenge we observe across our studies as well. So the typical scenario for our study, especially for the first 2 months, I would say, we recruit, we have people who sign up very keen, and then within the first week, well, I have something else to do, or I'm too tired today. And so it's a lot of sort of inertia to overcome. What we find is that it's really about making small changes, and that's what I try to do in today's presentations, really to break down some of the numbers to really sort of understandable quantities and time frames. And so when we really look at some of the data here, we're talking about 15 minutes per day. Or vice versa, if you flip it around, is not to sit or be in a lying position for more than 23 hours and 45 minutes. Right? It's really how you frame it. And so I think the typical thought is, okay, I have to exercise 30 minutes a day or an hour a day. And then we think, well, I can't afford that 30 minutes. I can't afford that 1 hour. And I go through this myself. You know, when I'm trying to finish off a grant, it's like, oh, do I really go now? But I always tend to try to reverse it. Well, what about saying that you just won't sit for more than 23 and a half hours a day, right? And when you think about it that way, you kind of feel silly, right? I don't know, I do, you know, that you can't manage to potentially just get up for 15 minutes. And again, when we talk about the walking pace, the walking distances, they're not astronomical. And and this is something we try to sort of share with our participants as well. We're just looking for little changes. And we always try to document as well. And there's actually quite a few online calculators or calendars that are quite useful. And I think once you start getting the habit of monitoring yourself, you kind of don't want to let yourself down either. But yes, you do have to start it, but I do think those little steps really help, whether it's just recording your activity for that one day, and then you kind of get into habits like, well, I recorded it yesterday, I better record it today. So you kind of force yourself to do that extra 15 minutes that maybe you wouldn't have in the past. It is, again, a challenge, but I keep reiterating this, is the small changes, and then it tends to trickle. And I'm sure all of you guys have heard this before, but I do think it does work, and I think you just have to keep emphasizing it. Social network, social support is also very helpful. We do try to engage with the family members. So for many of our exercise programs or classes, the spouses or close family member or caregiver are more than welcome to join us. We really are quite flexible, so certainly during the summertime, many of our participants actually bring their grandchildren to class because they're the babysitters for them, and so we really kind of open it up and try to be as inclusive as possible to, again, remove barriers. Transportation is also another issue, so certainly, I mean, that's kind of beyond our ability to sort of change at a global level, but we certainly do try to help and work with them and their physicians to potentially organize handy darts or even just map out the transit buses that they would take and the schedules just to sort of help them along.
Teresa, thank you very much for your presentation. I particularly liked your analogy of the brain networking functioning being similar to an orchestra. It actually reminded me of the days when I was in high school in school band, and Mr. Peely used to remind us that the band is only as good as its weakest member. He was usually looking at me when he was saying that, but I'm wondering in your interventions, particularly in your RCTs,
Yes.
you don't have a no treatment condition, just a usual
Yes.
group, and it's almost as if you're treating the stretching group as usual care if it was in a pharma context. And then I'm wondering if you're sort of then underselling the effectiveness of your intervention, because I suspect the effect would be much larger compared to them, because even in some of the older trials, the stretching condition was the intervention condition. So if you could just comment on that, please.
Sure. So yes, I completely agree with you. In the context of how we design our current randomized control trial, we're probably providing a very conservative estimate. Okay, so I absolutely agree with you. Now, why we typically have that balance and tone group, again, it is to account for the other confounds that people may come up with, saying, well, it's not really the exercise, it's the socialization, or no, it's the fact that now they're just simply coming to your center twice a week, while before they barely even got out of the house. So it's really to control for those variables that we think may tie in with joining a research program and just coming to class, aside from the actual training itself. I can also confirm that we have a current ongoing trial where it's almost closed off, and it has there's no active control group at all. So they really are just usual care, seeing the neurologist. And you're right, right now the preliminary effect size is huge. It's much bigger than what we observed in our previous studies. And I think part of it is because we have this actual do nothing control arm.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It was really very, very nice. I'm just wondering, along the same lines of the different comparison groups, it seems that one of the things that's very central to what's being done is that there's a lot of social interaction and fun. You know, where the video clip you showed was really delicious, I must say. And I'm wondering, you know, again, you know, how much of that is required, how much of the social aspect could explain some of the changes that are occurring, and does it make sense to have another control group, which you would have people just sit and chat about, you know, daily activities, sort of like just a discussion group, basically?
Yeah, and that is something that I think is being explored. And certainly for us, we are launching a randomized controlled trial, hopefully in October, looking at that among stroke survivors. So for chronic stroke survivors, whereby we'll look at an exercise arm, a control arm that does the balance and stretch, and a third arm where it's more socialization and more cognitively stimulation. So they'll be sort of participating in volunteering, group activities, but no exercise to really look at that. It is a study, it is something that's a bit hard to capture though, because socialization, you see it, it's hard to measure, in terms of as objectively as, let's say, some of the other outcomes that were more, that we typically measured. But yes, I agree, it's something that I think we need to have a better understanding of, and we're trying to at this point.
Yeah, have all the studies looked at exercise in one chunk, as in adults going to a class, or have any of them looked at it in a kind of a cumulative effect, so doing 15 minutes over the course of a day, for example?
Yes, there was actually a trial that was published in 2008 by an Australian group, and what they looked at is really, so their intervention was physical activity over a course of a week. It didn't matter what type. So the participants within the intervention group just had to acquire 150 minutes of physical activity, whether it's strength training, walking, swimming, it was up to them. And they also found benefit as compared with a usual group.
Thank you. I have a very layman question. No? Okay.
Go ahead.
The question I have is, one of the studies you had shown, it was dealing with women being active as a teenager and 30 and 50 and so on. What about men that, to me there's kind of, can be two groups of men. There's men that are laborers and work hard with metals and lifting. There's the businessmen that maybe don't require that type of activity in their daily lives. And those men, though they're active in their daily lives, can struggle with weight or possibly, in the end, cognitive decline. Can you just tell me what we would use to motivate those same laborer types that say, well, no, I work hard all day, I don't need any, or did it have an effect in their senior years? What kind of effect did it have?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to that question. So in terms of looking at work-related physical activity and how that might be protective later on in years, I'm not aware of a study that specifically addressed that particular question. If is your other question relating how to motivate men of that particular background? Well, in general, we find it more challenging to motivate men. Oh boy, this is where the tomatoes might come out here. And that's actually one of the speculations we have, is that potentially the bias we see for, or the greater benefit for women that we see in studies may simply because women are more compliant, they're more keen to participate in studies, and they potentially gain more from socialization and from sort of the group environment. We don't know that. This is just speculation among researchers who work with men and women. I find men tend to participate more if they're being competitive. We see that quite often in our trials. So currently in our walking randomized control trial among individuals with vascular cognitive impairment, for one particular class, we have 2 men who literally race with each other. Despite the fact, they have cardiovascular issues, and we're always saying you need to, set the target rate, you need to monitor your heart rate through the heart rate monitor that you're wearing, but they will go at it if both are in class. If one is not in class on a particular day, then it's much more manageable. So, I don't know, maybe competition?
I'd like to ask about a different population, a younger population of singles, couples, perhaps families, who have trouble with decision making because of various facets of their life, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, mental illness, etc. Can physical activity help that population?
I'm not an expert per se in that particular area, but based on my understanding of the limited literature that I have read, certainly Brian Christie has looked at fetal alcohol syndrome and exercise, and he has shown beneficial effects as well. Certainly for children, there is emerging evidence to show that seems to be helpful for kids with attention deficit disorder as well and hyperactivity. So I think, I speculate that it probably could be beneficial, but I don't know for sure because I don't know the literature as well as I should.
Thank you for your talk. My question, sorry, I'm right here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I can see you, you can't see me. My question for you is related to the Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines for older adults that were published in 2011. And in those current guidelines, there's no real mention of the protective effect of exercise on cognitive function, I believe, because there's been some controversy and uncertainty in the literature.
Yeah.
Do you think that the field is moving closer so that the next version of those guidelines will have a clearer message about that, or is it still quite a big gray area?
My personal opinion is I think, it's supportive. There's more to be done. I totally would say that there needs to be more done within the context, again, of exact prescription and exact benefit among different populations. But if you're talking about the overall effect, I would say yes. It is quite disappointing because not only, with those particular guidelines didn't include it, but the NIH actually, their report actually said that it was inconclusive as well back in 2010. And Art Kramer and I, and actually Leon Flicker, actually wrote a response to that saying that, really it isn't inconclusive, more needs to be done, but, what area of research doesn't require more things to be done, really. So I would argue that even back in 2010, we had pretty good evidence, but I think certainly in the last, 3 years, even a really nice study have come out, both at the cohort level, the population level, and also within randomized control trial. And also what's really promising is that now there are efforts across multi-centers or between countries trying to conduct large randomized control trials where we could have enough samples to really look at how a specific intervention may actually diminish dementia risk. Within these RCTs, we don't have enough sampling or time horizon to really look at, whether strength training or aerobic training will ultimately reduce your risk of developing dementia as compared to, let's say, the balance and tone group. But I do think if you compile the RCT data with the existing cohort data, I think it's good evidence. And again, if we also even look at what are risk factors for dementia, so diabetes, high blood pressure, stroke, small vessel disease, we concretely know, again, in those bodies of literature, that exercise reduces the risk factors of those chronic conditions. So I think if we look at the literature and synthesize all of it, I think we would all be in agreement that it is beneficial. But if you start deciding only take certain studies and nitpicking at sort of, well, it didn't actually show, reduction in dementia risk, yeah, we're not quite there. But I would argue, some other evidence have made it into guideline care that didn't necessarily reach that level of robustness either, so.
I really enjoyed your cost effectiveness slide for resistance training. One question is, was there anything done for aerobic training, or would you kind of assume those costs are similar? And two is kind of how do you measure the cost effectiveness of it?
Sure. So actually within I didn't report the findings, but within that trial where we looked at aerobic resistance training among individuals with MCI, we did actually find that both aerobic and resistance training was cost effective. The paper is actually coming out today. And it's the work that's done by my postdoc, Jen Davis. So she's a person who's trained in health econ, not myself. But basically within these trials, what we do is that from day one, once they enter our studies, that they actually document all their healthcare costs throughout the trial. And if we have a follow-up period, we also ask them to document that as well. And then she costs that out in conjunction to the known Canadian healthcare dollars, and then they basically compare that. That's the global way. If you want the details, Jen would be the best person to ask.
Okay. Thanks everyone for the question. I actually have one question. It's about, most of what you talked about today has been sort of the chronic effects of exercise on cognitive ability. What's the evidence supporting acute effects?
So there is a lot of studies looking at the acute effects, and overall the acute effects does seem to suggest that, you know, if you do an acute bout of exercise and you quickly measure how people are performing, it's a bit more equivocal. Some studies will show benefits, so increased attention, increased awareness, increased reaction time, while others will not show similar benefit. I do think that might relate to potentially the level of exertion at that point in time. You can imagine if you really had to do a high bout, high load exercise bout, and then have to do a cognitive task, you might just simply be taxed out, literally, right? Those studies typically are done to look at some of the underlying mechanisms per se as to why we see changes in cognition, but I would, yeah, overall, their trends are not as, I think, consistent per se.
Okay, thanks. I have a budget meeting this afternoon, and I noticed on one of your early slides I'm right at the precipice of numeric decline in my cognitive ability, so I thought maybe a quick walk to the budget meeting would help me, but it is equivocal. I'd like to thank you for the presentation. This is a small token from ACAL, and I'd like to ask everyone to actively thank Teresa for her time today.